Babbage and His Engines, Part 5, The Modern Computer and the Legacy Left by Charles Babbage and Ada Lovelace. We finished up on the history of computing with the mechanical calculators in the United States around the year 1900. And at about that time, Herman Hollerith was working for the US Census Office, a German-American, and he came up with some ideas to record the census using punched cards. He repurposed the cards for the Jacquard loom, only punching out the holes where data was needed. He was able to do this because instead of using mechanical equipment, he was using electromechanical equipment. The punch cards were passed over a drum, and over the drum was like a comb of narrow brass strips. And when a hole was there, the brass strip would go through the hole, complete an electric circuit. So then things can be done with electromagnets and relays and the such. Here's a 1910 tabulating machine to sort cards. Now, at that time, and today, of course, every factory requires an office. And the factory was the blue-collar workers, and the office was the emerging middle class. And offices were necessary, of course, because somebody had to source supplies, pay the suppliers, pay the workers, look after maintenance on the equipment, and run sales, marketing, and shipping, and all the other things that have to go on. And at that time, the books were, of course, handwritten ledgers. And mechanical calculators were used to balance the books. The difference with Hollerith's equipment is that the punch cards were, in fact, the books. A single punch card would be an entry in the ledger, and a deck of punch cards would be the ledger, and they were carried around and put into various machines to do the necessary work. Here's an early IBM flowchart of reading electric meters. The electric meter readers would fill in forms at the individual houses and apartments. These would be punched into cards, and they'd be punched a second time to verify the first punching was correct. And then the detailed cards would be sorted by customer number. And then they'd be merged with the master customer's cards that would contain the name, address, and any outstanding amounts from the previous bill. And the calculator would figure out the new outstanding balance, and then printers would print the bills to go out to the customer. Cards would be produced for entries into the rest of the accounting system, and a new set of MasterCards with a new balance produced, and these would be fed back into the next month's billing cycle. Hollerith's business merged with two other businesses and eventually became IBM, International Business Machines. And in the 30s and 40s, Thomas J. Watson was president of IBM. The word think over his head there was on a placard on every employee's desk back in the 60s, and maybe even today. Now, he was a success. He was a remarkable businessman, and his success came by leasing his machines rather than selling them. By leasing, it generated a monthly revenue. And under the lease agreement, the customer had to purchase the millions of punch cards from IBM. The customer won as well, because the customer got a monthly service by an IBM technician who would go through, check out the machines, replace stuff that was worn but before it caused the machine to fail. And the punch cards were very high quality from IBM. So it was very, very seldom that the cards jammed up. So it was really win-win for the customer and IBM. But in addition, it was in the Depression, and the customer didn't have to make any additional purchase payment. So they could adjust the number of machines month by month based upon the way business was going. And as a result, IBM did very well. It was growing its business in the US, well, the US economy floundered. And Thomas Watson took care of his employees. IBM was among the first corporations to provide group life insurance, survivor benefits, and paid vacations. However, it wasn't all for the greater good. Watson was a great admirer of Hitler. Watson traveled to Germany several times, met Hitler, and was awarded the Order of the German Eagle by Adolf Hitler, the highest award for non-military operations. Shortly after Hitler's invasion of Poland, Watson shifted his European manufacturing to that country. And the plant in Poland was a fully subsidized, start again. The plant in Poland was a fully subsidized, what do you call it? Subsidiary. Okay. The plant, shortly after blah 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 blah. Shortly after Hitler's invasion of Poland, Watson shifted his European operations to Poland, and the plant there was a wholly subsidized subsidiary. I'll start it again. Wholly owned. Shortly after Hitler's invasion of Poland, Watson shifted his European manufacturing to Poland, and his plant there was a wholly owned subsidiary of IBM in Geneva. The IBM office, in charge of the Geneva office, used the Geneva office to launder revenue from all the punch card equipment in occupied Europe. Cards, and there were billions of them, were made in countries that could trade with Germany, Portugal, South America, and others. And the monthly maintenance throughout Europe was carried out by Polish employees of IBM using service manuals printed in English. And throughout the war, the German railways were scheduled by IBM equipment, and every camp had its punch card department to track prisoners and schedule the gas chambers. And again, all the revenue went back through Geneva. The census cards that were used to identify Jews were designed in New York, and the same cards would be used later to identify Japanese when they were incarcerated by the US. The historians Goltz Alley and Karl Roth have argued that before every act of extermination, there must first be an act of registration. After the war, a congressional committee investigated companies that had dealt with the enemy. IBM was near the top of the list. The company was considered too important for wartime recovery. During that time, in England, Alan Turing, mathematician, was working at Bletchley Park, building the bombs, which is electromechanical devices, to break the German Enigma code. He was very successful at this. And he also built the Colossus machines. These were vacuum tube machines that ran a lot faster than the electromechanical bombs, and they were used to break the much more complicated Lorentz cipher used by the German High Command. Again, extremely successful in the war effort. These machines, the Colossus, were operated by vacuum tubes, and the first machines to actually have done so. Some people argue that they are the first computers. Some people argue they're not, because they were specifically designed to break the Lorentz cipher, not as general purpose machines. But either way, they were incredibly sophisticated for the time, and certainly excellent demonstrations of how computers would later be built. Turing's engineer from the post office was Tommy Flowers. And Tommy Flowers played the role of Clements did to Babbage. And he was very familiar, worked on the design, in fact, did do much of the design of the bomb and the Colossus. And when the war ended, Of course, all the people that worked on the project at Bletchley Park were all held under the Official Secrets Act, so they couldn't talk about the work they had done. The British were obviously very concerned. They didn't want Russia to know, but they'd broken the German codes, and we were going into the Cold War at that point. The problem was that Flowers was sent to America to talk to the emerging American computer industry. And because of the reciprocal agreement with the US, he was released from the Official Secrets Act while he was there. So he could tell the new companies starting to work on computers all the problems and difficulties they had with the Colossus and how they solved them. Back in England, he and Turing and the others that worked at Bletchley Park were unable to talk to the people in the emerging computer industry in Britain. And that's obviously not the only reason, but it's certainly one of the reasons why the American companies got way ahead of the rest of the world after the war in building computers. In the United States, von Neumann, Hungarian-American mathematician and polymath, he filled Babbage's and Alan Turing's roles in the saga in the United States. And when he designed his computers, he said, make it like Babbage. So he was certainly aware of what Babbage had done, as I'm sure Turing was. But they wouldn't have had access directly to Babbage's papers, or at least I don't think they did. They would have got most of their information from Menabre's paper. Von Neumann was, as I said, a polymath, and as well as developing the computers in the States, he came up with a branch of mathematics called game theory that was used extensively during the Cold War, and it resulted in the term MAD, mutually assured destruction. That was a strategy used against Russia in the Cold War. Now, von Neumann's group thought that the data and instructions should be kept in a single store inside the computer. And further, that the instructions should be encoded so they could be modified by other instructions. That meant that one program could be treated as data by another program. The German engineer Konrad Zuse, working on computers as well, had considered and rejected this possibility as too dangerous for his computers. I didn't know what dangerous meant when I first read this, but reading on, it said that its conclusion by von Neumann's group made possible high-level programming languages and most of the advances in software. Well, most definitely yes, but of course it opened up the door for viruses. If the programs had been stored somewhere other than the place where data is stored, it could have been locked down very easily, and therefore there couldn't have been viruses. But the advantages of programming languages, modern programming languages, is so great that we put up with viruses and do spend an awful lot of time stopping programs maliciously changing other programs. All computers are called Turing machines. All computers with stored programs are known as von Neumann machines. In the Colossus, the program wasn't stored in the machine's memory. It was stored on paper tape. Here's a picture of the ENIAC, which is von Neumann's machine, a vacuum tube machine worked by decimals, and it's interesting to compare it with the analytical engine. About 100 years apart, both decimal, Babbage's memory was about 5,000 digits, decimal digits. The ENIAC had very little memory. Vacuum tubes are difficult to use, particularly at that time, expensive. So they had very little of it. But they had one big advantage. They could dump memory onto a magnetic tape and read it back at some later point. So in a sense, memory was unlimited. The sizes of the machines were comparable. They were both used punch cards for both the programs and the data going in. Babbage's machine would produce output on punch cards, printer, stereotype, and the plotter. The ENIAC only produced punch cards output. But that was fine, because in 1945, they had access to all sorts of IBM punch card equipment. So we could take the cards out of the ENIAC and post-process them, sorting, merging, etc., and producing nice printed reports. The speed, of course, was the big difference. Babbage estimated 2.5 minutes to do a multiplication, yet the ENIAC was doing 200 a second. By the end of its useful life in 1956, the ENIAC had 18,000 vacuum tubes, 7,200 crystal diodes, vacuum tubes are valves, 1,500 relays, 70,000 resistors, 10,000 capacitors, I think some countries call them condensers, and approximately 5 million hand-soldered joints. It consumed 150 kilowatts of electricity, and it said whenever the computer was switched on, lights in Philadelphia dimmed. I don't completely believe that, but it's a nice story. It was mainly used for the hydrogen bomb development and for simulating various strategies in game theory, the mutually assured destruction that got us through the Cold War. Now, why binary versus decimal? Well, for a mechanical system, base 10 arithmetic, it's a good compromise. You see, if you use a larger base 20 or 30 or more, you can get more digits around a figure wheel, so you need fewer figure wheels. However, the wheels get big and ungainly and more difficult to use because of the more teeth on the gears. And you've got to convert the numbers going in and coming out. If you use a smaller base than 10, you need more figure wheels, but the mechanical linkages between them become simpler. Babbage considered all kinds of number bases. He thought 20 was the optimum number, but he thought it wasn't worth the effort because of the necessity of converting data in and out. It's quite different for an electronic system, where binary is definitely superior. To take an example, in a decimal computer, you need 10 voltages to represent digits. So maybe 1 volt is 1, 2 volts is 2, etc. Well, it's difficult to keep those voltages apart. You see, component variables, such as resistors in the 1950s and 60s, were typically 10% tolerance. Well, 10% of 10 is 1. So a resistor that's 10% out of true, so to speak, would cause a number 10 to be thought of as a number 9. Well, that's not good. And more expensive resistors to have higher precision are very expensive and difficult to make. So if you go to a binary system, you only need 2 voltages, so there's lots of room between them for a safety band. In modern 3.3 volt circuitry, anything below 0.8 of a volt is low or 0 or off. Anything above 2 volts is high or 1 or on. And that gap between 0.8 and 2 volts, if any voltage goes into that gap, the electronics are set up so that the computer will just stop with a warning. And this is what Babbage did in his difference engine. Remember, he had that lock that came in, and if the figure wheel gearing had worn, the lock would come in and hit the end of a gear tooth and not slip into the adjacent space between teeth. It's the same thing here. Voltage is outside of range, stops the thing down. Transistors, on the other hand, are very cheap to replicate. That is, if they only go on or off. The sort of transistors you have in a stereo set or in a car radio have to amplify a range of voltages and do so accurately. So they're expensive, but you only need a few of them. It didn't take long before computers got so cheap that kids could buy them to play games and put them in their bedrooms. And here we see an Atari ski game from the 1980s. You use the joystick to keep the skier on the top left there to come down the slope and go between the flags. If the skier goes outside of a flag, the game stops. If you manage to get to the end of the ski slope, and the screen there scrolls up, so as the skier comes down, the flags are moving up, and so you go through lots of gates between flags before you get to the end. If you do get to the end, then your score is, well, how long it took you to get there. So the idea is to build up the minimum score, the minimum time. And a few years later, PCs came along and you couldn't buy an Atari anymore. And people like playing these games. So today, you can go to the internet and you can download an emulator program and you can download the original Atari ski game. The idea is you run the emulator and you can run the ski game because the emulator will pretend it's an Atari and run the instructions inside the Atari program. But from the user's perspective, it's just another program on the PC. And the joystick is emulated through the mouse or through the arrow keys. So a few years after that, the home computers got powerful enough that they could run neural networks. Now, a neural network is a series of nodes. You've got an input layer, an output layer, and a group of hidden nodes. Those hidden layers, it could just be one node, or it could be millions of nodes. And modern programming languages support these. They have libraries. You tell it how the configuration is set up, and it does its thing. And doing this thing is that you put a number in to the input layer. In fact, here you've got 3 inputs, so you put in 3 numbers. And I've just shown 10 going into the first number. That number is distributed to the 4 nodes at the beginning of the hidden layer, because every node is linked to all the nodes in the next layer down. So there are 4 linkages between that 10 on the top left and the first 4 column in the first hidden layer. And the distribution on the linkages is a percentage, 20, 30, 40, and 10 in this example. So the program takes 10, distributes it across to the first column in the hidden layer by the percentages. And then it goes to the next number down in the input layer and distributes it, adding it to the numbers that are already there. When it's distributed all the input layers, then it goes down to the 2, 3, 4, and 1 and distributes those across to the next layer. And so on all the way down to the output. In this case, there's only one output. And this can be run along with the Atari game, the emulator, and a training program. And what the training program does, it goes to the emulator and it basically says, where's the skier? The emulator sends back the coordinates of the skier. The training program passes those coordinates back into the input layer. And that gets distributed across the network. And the output gets passed down to the training program and gets passed on to the emulator that pretends to be a joystick. And the Atari game moves the skier ahead 1 step. And then that repeats itself. The training program picks up the new coordinates, passes back, etc. Well, of course, that doesn't do anything because these percentages in here aren't set up. To get the thing started, the training program just puts random numbers in there. So, of course, the first time you run the thing, the skier very quickly runs off the sides of the screen, doesn't go through the gates, and it just the game's over. So the training program goes and makes a random change, maybe in this area here. It just changes some of these percentages, quite at random. And then it starts another game, goes through the whole process again, and it looks at how long the skier kept running. Well, if it increased from the time before, then the training program will make more changes in the style that it had done before. If it slowed down the skier, came off the track earlier, then the training program will go and make changes somewhere else in here. Now, it's not quite that simple. the training program, how it makes these changes is quite sophisticated. But the point is that it makes random changes, basically random changes. And eventually, over time, after running the game about 4 million times, the percentage would have stabilized into numbers that will cause the game, the skier, to get through all of the gates and have a fairly decent game. 4 million iterations, and it's about as good as most typical players. Another use of neural networks is to read handwritten numerals, in this case 504192. And this is a sort of program that probably a computer science student would do, or a hobbyist in a computer club. And you can find on the internet training data, which will be thousands of number pairs. What I mean that is thousands of little graphics, and each graphic will have a handwritten digit on it, like 5, and the number 5. So a training program has the graphic that it can pass up down to the neural network, and the neural network's output can be compared. So it can train the neural network to read these numbers. And it's not necessary to get a very high score in reading the numbers. What's more important is that the numbers it does read are correct, and the numbers it has problems with, it flags as I don't know. It's not good to have things incorrect. So somebody a few years ago took one of these neural network programs, and they converted the training data into punch cards for data for the analytical engine. And they took the computer program in a high-level language, and they would have written another program that converted it, instruction by instruction, into instruction cards for the analytical engine. And then they took those cards on electronic form, of course, and ran them through the emulator, the analytical engine emulator. And it worked. They got the same output that you get from a modern computer. So it's another indication that, yes, the analytical engine is indeed a computer. It'll run neural networks. There are a couple of problems, however. The card deck, if it had actually been punched out, for both the training data and the instructions, would have been several times higher than Mount Everest. And there was debate on how long it would take the program to run. The question is whether it was tens or hundreds of millions of years. But it did work. Now, artificial intelligence, ChatGPT, it uses a large language model, and it has nodes, just like the neural network has nodes. But they aren't specifically linked together at the start. And the training program goes to the internet, and it extracts every word it can find on the internet, which will include any online libraries, newspaper archives, blogs, anything like that. And a word is put into a node, or rather a node is created every time there's a word. And I just need to be clear here. I'm using the word word, but it's not really a word. The computer doesn't know anything about that. All it knows is that there are symbols such as DOG, which could be either upper or lowercase. They could be numbers. They could be various symbols of exclamations and such. So it's probably close to 100 different symbols when you look at all the special stuff that goes on. The important thing is that there are groups of symbols separated by spaces. So we think of those as words. The computer just takes it as a group. It doesn't have to be a word. Anyway, it builds up a node of this for each word, and you can see exactly where I'm going because of my choice of words. And as the training program builds up these nodes, it builds up linkage between the nodes. Now, of course, you could link every word to every other word pretty well, but the only reason you have a linkage is if the words are close together in the text, original text. So dog and moon, the dog and man are very close, and so they have a very high percentage. walk and man, there are high percentages as well, but not as high as dog and man. So off it goes doing that. And things like dog and moon, the linkages is, well, there is a linkage. It's probably somewhere a dog baying at the moon, but it's such a rare thing that the linkage may not even be recorded inside the computer. The point is, however, that there are percentages there. So when we write, ask who was the first man to walk on the moon? A program takes the important words, man, walk, moon, finds them in this vast, great network of millions of entries, and looks for other words that are also linked to them. And of course, Armstrong pops up. And Armstrong's linked to walk, man, and moon, and other things in other situations, but not linked to dog, or very rarely or infrequently. So Armstrong pops out as being the most likely thing, this most common thing that ties these other words together. And Neil, of course, appears quite often and is often related to Armstrong. And when it is, it appears in front of Armstrong and would also be related to walk, dog. I'm going to do this all over again because I made a bloody mess of it. Okay, here we go. When we ask who was the first man to walk on the moon, the program, not the training program, the program that runs this thing, can extract the important words, man, walk, moon, finds them in these vast networks of millions of words, and looks at the linkages between them. And walk, dog, man, and moon are all linked together in some way or other. It looks for other words that are also linked to these keywords, and Armstrong pops up. But Armstrong isn't linked to dog, or at least not in any significant way. But Armstrong is linked to walk, moon, and man. And Neil also appears in this reference. It also connects to walk, moon, and man, and strongly to Armstrong, and always in front of Armstrong. So it doesn't take the program very long to figure out that Neil Armstrong was the first man to walk on the moon, not knowing anything about words or word meanings, just the probability of their relationships. Going back to the Atari ski game, a couple of years ago, somebody replaced the training program with an AI program. And it runs absolutely fine. But before they had the AI program start, it gave it the text from the original instruction manual used that came out and was published along with the Atari game. Having read the instruction manual, the program only took about 12,000 iterations to come up with a sensible game-playing strategy within the network, as compared to about 4 million if it hadn't read the instructions of how to play the game. I said that it wasn't picking up words when the large language module was built by the training program. It'll pick up other things. So SCH and SC, for example, aren't words, but they're separated by spaces. And so, of course, groups of letters separated by spaces. So, of course, they came out and they have nodes in the network. And some of you will have recognized that these are crochet patterns. So you can go to ChatGPT, open a free account, and ask for a crochet pattern to, for example, crochet a cat sitting at a window. And people do this, and they get crochet needles and real yarn, excuse me, and they print, they crochet real cats or whatever they've asked it to do, and then they take photographs and they post them onto a website, and you can find the website by Googling AI crochet cats. More interesting to me is that the training program also picked up all sorts of information about writing computer programs. There are lots of tutorials and lots of blogs about programming. And as part of some work I was doing on the analytical engine model, I was using a computer program I wasn't familiar with, on a microcontroller I wasn't familiar with. So I asked it to write me a MicroPython program for RPI shaft encoder code. It doesn't matter what that means, it's irrelevant. Um, but the important thing is that ChatGPT came back with some code, and it's shown on the right. And I had a description. The code uses interrupt-based handling. Well, I'd written code to do this on other microcontrollers in other languages, but I hadn't thought of this interrupt-based handling, which is actually a very good way of doing it. And this code actually did work. I have to put in a caveat, however. I know how to write programs. And the best analogy I could find is that if you had seen a car at a distance, but you'd never driven it in a car, and you certainly hadn't driven one yourself, if you sat in a car and asked the navigation system to tell you how to get somewhere, and the navigation system said, take the third exit from the roundabout and keep in the left lane to merge onto the M4 eastbound or some such, it would be absolutely meaningless. But if you know how to drive a car, the instructions are perfectly good. If you went from driving a car to driving a motorbike or a transport truck, you'd have to modify the instructions about how you actually go about doing these merges and so on. But it would be perfectly useful. You can use it, no trouble at all. Now, enough of that. Babbage's heritage. And in Babbage's life, he saw the world as quite simple and somewhat idyllic to us. And he saw the Industrial Revolution. He saw the pollution, and the Victorians knew about global warming. And in 1824 paper, Fourier hypothesized that gases in the atmosphere must create barriers that acted to trap heat. And here's John Tyndall's setup for measuring radiant heat absorption by gases. And later in the 19th century, they knew that the cancer rates near people living near railroad tracks were above the norm. And we can't blame Babbage for that. And much of the wealth during the Industrial Revolution came from the cotton textile industry, which was 2.5% of Britain's added value in the 1760s. It went up to 22% in 1831. And that, of course, depended on child labor and slavery. And for us, particularly important, compound interest tables and all sorts of modern accounting practices that we use today were necessary to keep this massively complicated system of slavery, cotton production, and fabric production in Britain. Again, can't blame that on Babbage, but the thinking machines offspring did give us this sort of factory, completely different type of manufacturing, and it gave us a different type of pollution. It sort of looks better, but it's far more difficult to get rid of. And it's given us these massive data centers, which currently produce a greater amount of greenhouse warming gases than does the commercial aircraft industry. We got some good things. We've got Zoom meetings, and this picture of a Zoom meeting was actually generated by artificial intelligence. We got the COVID-19 vaccine. It wouldn't have happened without modern computers. And we get wind farms, solar farms, electric vehicles, and all sorts of other things that are potentially helpful in dealing with our problem with global heating. What we don't have is people like Menabrea. After going back to Italy, he lectured on the Babbage engine, military officer. He became professor of mechanics at the local university and eventually served several terms as prime minister. Apparently very successful at unifying Italy and producing a nice, pleasant society. And even as prime minister, he tried to get away a few hours a week to go down to a laboratory to do a bit of work. The other people involved in the development of the computers didn't do so well. In fact, it's a rather sad story. John von Neumann, Medal of Freedom, and the crater on the moon is named after him. He worked on the Manhattan Project, and he died of pancreatic or prostate cancer at the age of 54. The military were really concerned that under the pain-killing drugs he would take for his cancer, he might hallucinate and spout out details of the atomic bomb program. And so they moved him to a private room. They had a military guard outside of his room, 24/7, an armed guard. Anytime anybody, a friend, relative, or medical person went into his room, the armed guard had to be with them with instructions to shoot everybody in the room if he said anything related to atomic bombs. Fortunately, he didn't. Alan Turing, after the war, came up with all sorts of really neat stuff to do with modern computers. A few years ago, the University of Manchester were throwing out some desks, and they were going through them, and somebody found a file inside of which were some notes in Alan Turing's handwriting. It included notes for a lecture he had never delivered, but the lecture laid out the way artificial intelligence works today. Unfortunately, he was gay. He was found caught by the police, and his security clearance was cancelled. He was forced to take chemical castration, even though he's personally considered responsible for saving 14 million lives by shortening the war. The chemical castration affected his brain. He couldn't think properly, and he committed suicide at the age of 42. George Schwartz and his brother, Edvard, from Sweden, who'd built the simplified difference engine and brought it to England, couldn't get any interest at all. They died penniless. Charles Babbage, 1791 to 1871, died at age 80. And he was a cantankerous old man, resigned to his failure. A good friend wrote, "He told me with distress one day that he'd forgotten my name and my father's name. He had also forgotten his cards. So he pulled a small brass cogwheel out of his waistcoat pocket and scratched his name on it, leaving it as his calling card." After he died, a visiting card was found in his jacket pocket. On the one side, it said Countess of Lovelace. On the other side, in Ada's handwriting, very interesting. Ada had died 29 years earlier. Ada herself hated this portrait. She said, "It makes her chin look so large you could write the word mathematics on it." But she did leave us this wonderful quotation. "The analytical engine weaves algebraic patterns, just as a jacquard loom weaves flowers and leaves." She wrote, "I have my hopes, and very distinct ones too, of one day getting cerebral phenomena, such I can put them in mathematical equations. In short, a law or laws for the mutual actions of the molecules of the brain, equivalent of a law of gravitation for the planetary and sidereal world." She refers to this as a calculus of the nervous system. One can fairly say that Ada Lovelace was the first person ever to glimpse with any clarity what has become a defining phenomena of our technology and even our civilization: the notion of universal computation. The mathematician Hannah Fry wrote, "Intelligent she might have been, but she was also manipulative and aggressive, a drug addict, a gambler, and an adulteress." Well, all of that's absolutely true. But she did realize the danger of the laudanum taken with alcohol, and she quit, which must have been incredibly difficult to do. She'd have had no help from other medications or the medical profession. I can't imagine. Anyway, she turned to mesmerism, which was a kind of a cult pseudoscience by the German Dr. Mesmer, who thought that all living things, including plants, had powers that could be directed to help somebody who has a medical condition. All the pictures I could find of mesmerism on the web all have young men mesmerizing women. I'll say no more about that. Ada herself died at age 36 of uterine cancer. She had a miserable death. She'd given up the laudanum, was in considerable pain. Her only solace was Charles Dickens reading at her bedside. At her request, she was buried next to her father, Byron, and she had named her two sons, Byron and Gordon. My friend Helen said, in trying to pin down a life, we create fictions about it. No more so than with Ada Lovelace. Known as the first programmer, well, she was the first one to publish a program, but she certainly wasn't the first programmer. Ada Lovelace Day is the second Tuesday of October. It celebrates women in STEM careers, raises awareness and challenges faced by women, and the importance of female role models in STEM. And closing the gender gap is not just a matter of fairness, it is essential for creating a better future. And there's an Ada programming language. Now, this is all very well and good. And there's a book published for children, presumably schoolgirls. And they idolize Ada. They're very anodyne. They say things like, her father left when she was young. It seems that we need the essence of Ada to support an agenda, but not the rather inconvenient package. We can't tell our children the whole story. We can't tell them that Byron was busy shocking London high society after his affairs with Lady Caroline Lamb and Lady Oxford. His love for his half-sister Augusta, and they did have a child, not only made him a retrograde, but also strengthened the sense of guilt and doom that he had always felt. Facing mountain pressure because of his failed marriage, his scandalous affairs, and huge debts, he left England in 1816. Apparently, when he was at Cambridge University, he kept a tame bear in his rooms in college. Ada's mother spent much of her time following her own interest and left Ada with a governess. We see her here as the only woman in the First World Trade Anti-Slavery Convention. Victorian morality associated with family values, charity, and thriftless, along with sexual repression. Ada didn't follow any of that. She just barreled straight through it all. But somehow she was accommodated into Victorian society. As a child, she was sick with measles or possibly encephalitis, as she was bedridden for 3 years. As a teenager, she ran off with her French tutor. A neighbor of the tutor recognized her, contacted her mother, and of course she was brought home. As she said in a letter to her friend, it's all right. Penetration did not occur. She was prescribed laudanum with wine for her bipolar condition. She was addicted to opium, which is what laudanum is, addicted to opium and alcohol. She smoked marijuana. She lost at least one fortune at the races, and she had at least one affair. And although married, she often accompanied Babbage to social events. There's no evidence they were romantically involved, but she'd had several hundred letters in her possession, and most of them were burnt by her mother after she died. It's an irony. If she were alive today, she would not have coped with the school system, as she would likely be one of the 5% of children who are medicated. And as a bipolar adult, she would obviously receive further medications to conform to our present normality. I think about 10% of adults in developed countries have some sort of medication for medical conditions, mental conditions. And we know that the antipsychotics that she would have been medicated often numbed the brain. And there are obviously parallel with Turing's, whose medication, conformed to modern society, destroyed his ability to think, resulting in suicide. I think it quite possible, in our world, she would have accomplished nothing. And I sometimes wonder what Ada's might be lurking in the corners of psych wards or in assisted living facilities, highly medicated and unable to do very much. She married the 8th Baron King in 1835 and had 3 children. I have been thinking much, and this is in a letter to Somerville, I've been thinking much of my qualities as a mamma or guardian of children, and I have come decisively to this conclusion. I am admirable as an organizer, director of others, superintendent, but practically, in details, the less I have habitually to do with children, the better, both for them and me. How many, many moments there are when their presence is most irritating and intolerable to me, and when a third person, given up to them, makes it quite a different thing. And a few years later, she wrote to Babbage as part of a 2,000-word letter. And the result is that I have plans for you. Then she proceeds to ask, if I am to lay before you, in the course of a year or two, explicit and honourable propositions for executing your engine, would there be any chance of allowing myself to conduct the business for you, and your own undivided energies being devoted to execution of the work? She knew that Babbage wasn't a people person, and she knew she could use her influence as a countess to open doors that would not be opened to mere Mr. Babbage. For all of his brilliance, Babbage couldn't think outside the box. We got these incredibly complex mechanisms designed to the minutest detail that could never be built. Who on earth would manufacture 25,000 parts before trying to see if they fit? Meanwhile, his friends couldn't see into his box. Ada was the only one who, as the instigator, the troublemaker, could possibly cross between these worlds. Ada was only 16 when money for the difference engine ran out, too young to point out that Babbage had the parts to build a simpler engine. By the time the analytical engine design had matured, she was dead. But what if she had lived? I know what if is a very dangerous game to play, but it's fun. And by not building and testing join the design of his project, nothing was done. See, this little model I made, I started off making a single gear, a single wheel, and then built up. And I found things out. Babbage never did this, so he didn't learn anything. See, Clement had spent considerable time building to plus or minus 2/1000th of an inch tolerance. If they had run tests on small sections, they would have found a way to design the parts to accommodate these tolerances, or even greater tolerances. The way I did it, blah, blah, blah. Clement spent considerable time building to 2/1000th of an inch tolerance. If they had run tests on small sections, they could have found a way to design the parts to accommodate much greater tolerances, and so speed up the production, cut the costs, and simplify assembly. In the case of my little model using a hobby 3D printer, I have 12/1000ths of an inch tolerance. And all the locking is done by static locks locked to the frame. And to compensate for the large tolerances, 12/1000ths of an inch, I cut angles on the top of the gears. So as they went up and engaged, things would self-align. There's nothing magic about this. Clement and his workers and Babbage would have realized within seconds that that's what they had to do. And the irony is, it would have been really easy because it's just a couple of extra strokes on a file when you make these gears. And The locking mechanism, as I said, I figured out how to do it with static locks. And again, if Clemens and Baggage had tried their locks, they'd have realized they had to do something else. I tried a Babbage way of locking, and I'll say, mere mortals, it's impossible, too complicated. And why on earth do a store with 150-digit numbers? It's insanity. I went back and looked at Ada's program, and I was going to write it myself out of a modern programming language. And I found that Jim Randall had done an excellent job, as had many others on the internet. And I was able to download a version of his program. And on the left, you see his results. It's the first 10 Bernoulli numbers expressed as fractions, which is the traditional way of doing it. Ada's program actually calculated the fourth number in that series. On the right, I made a very simple change to the program so I could see the numbers as decimals, which suited my needs better. And then I replaced the mechanisms inside the program that did the calculations so I could experiment to see what would happen if I used different number bases. So in this row here, I pretended that the analytical engine only has 8 figure wheels, 3 of them at the right of the decimal place, and the decimal place is arbitrary. The point is that the numbers here only have 8 digits. And it does calculate the Bernoulli numbers. It gives up at about this point here, but it calculates them well enough you can say, yes, the program is working. Not useful, but it's working. I then ran another sample, and this time with 20-digit numbers. And yes, it works very well, and it's good enough to do useful stuff. So based on that, I'm going to propose that an engine could be built, much simpler mechanisms. Now, the way Babbage handled all this complicated messing around with doing his multiplication and so on was to use the barrel organ mechanism. That was brilliant. But in the original barrel organ, compressed air came up through a pipe from the bellows below. The rotating drum opened and closed valves to direct the air to organ pipes. Babbage needed to get the pinions lifted to the correct sequence, and use of the organ drum was brilliant. Unfortunately, the only way he could see to transmit the motion was through rods, gears, and cams, necessitating incredibly complicated linkages and locking mechanisms. So the question is, could wires have brought power from a battery below with a drum, activating switches to send the power to electromagnets? And Wheatstone and Cook had done this in the electric telegraph. Here's an early version of the telegraph. They built later ones with more levers to do the whole alphabet. And the operator has 2 levers here. Let's take the lever on the left. He pushes it to the left. It closes a switch. As electric current goes through a wire, and at the receiving center, an electromagnet pulls the left-hand needle to the left. Nothing difficult about that. Clever at that time, brilliant, but nothing difficult. And here we are with the analytical engine, using an electromagnet to lift all the pinions in that group on the middle figure wheel. An electromagnet could do it just as well as all those linkages. In fact, I did try a prototype early on using an electromagnet. I didn't use it because it was too jerky for my printed parts, 3D printed parts. With mechanical systems, it will be fine. So I think it quite feasible to have built a simple electromechanical machine. Forget about the 100 by 50 digit numbers. A 16 8-digit numbers would demonstrate the thing works and feasibility. It would have built interest, attracted investors, and unlike the difference engine, there's a very incredible market. And expanding to 20 digits for doing something really useful just means putting another 8 layers, or floors if you like, on top of the engine. There's no greater complexity, no changes to that barrel organ drum. And eliminate everything not essential, such as the multiplying by the longest number, and go for a really simple printer. And I think Babbage could have afforded this. He had inherited £100,000 from his father. He could have come up with, £20,000 maybe, and done this. And if he'd done so, I think it would have advanced the computer age by at least 60 years. And it would have eliminated this distraction into punch card systems and IBM. Because by the time Hollerith was doing his work to design this in the 1900s, Babbage's designs, if they'd been built, would have made it obsolete. Now, in memory of Ada Lovelace, I'm going to play some music written by the Thinking Machine. It's Beethoven's 10th Symphony. It's just a small snippet. And I didn't think a barrel organ would do it justice. So we're going to hear the Bonn Orchestra.